Okay, welcome everybody. There's a bit of a delay on LinkedIn, so I have to get the streaming bits and bytes flowing over the internet so people can see and hear us. But here we are, Steve Zalewski and Mark Settle. Thank you. You're no strangers to my podcast. You've been guests before, and it's great to have you back. I guess this one's the Steve Tout Show. This isn't brand well. I didn't really brand this. I think I just wanted to get some real straight talk out there that could be accessible to cybersecurity leaders in the area of finance. So, Mark, Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure, Steve.
Yep, good to be here.
So, just to kick us off and to set some context, this session is called Strategic Finance for Cybersecurity Leaders. Why did I want to do this? I mean, we're headed into Q4 when a lot of cybersecurity leaders are planning for their next calendar year and / fiscal year of projects. And we, during our prep call, Steve and Mark, we had some pretty colorful language about how like 75% of their budget is already spent and they're quote unquote locked and loaded. And that 25% remaining remains in question. But why talk about finance now? And it's September. There's still a lot of months and time left in the year. Well, when I scan the, geopolitical uncertainties, the economic uncertainties out in the environment that businesses are operating in, it raises a lot of questions in my mind. With CFOs scrutinizing every dollar and cybersecurity leaders increasingly expected to align with the business and drive impact, right? That cost avoidance is only part of the equation. So the way I want to set the context for our conversation today is that strategic finance is cybersecurity leadership. There's a couple of interesting data points that were published this year, one by IANS and Artico Search, a survey of 587 CISOs found that only 47% reported a budget increase in 2025. That's down from 62% the previous year. So keep those numbers in mind as we have this conversation this coming hour. Meanwhile, 54% are facing flat or shrinking cybersecurity budgets. That's from IANS. And then the cyber budgets losing ground in IT spending. This is from Secure World. A similar kind of vibe here. Security spending as a percentage of overall IT budgets fell for the first time in 5 years, from 11.9 down to 10.9. So not a huge decline. It's a slight decline, but they're making room for things like AI and cloud, et cetera, that are taking priority. So that's the backdrop, the context, and the why we're going to have this conversation today. A couple of context setting questions that we'll be exploring. What pressures are CISOs under as they enter 2026 budget cycles? The insight here, the surveys that I mentioned, and why is financial literacy a core leadership skill? I want to dive into that with Steve and Mark today. Boards want to see cyber initiatives framed as business aligned investments, not as cost centers. So with that out of the way, for those of you who don't know my guest today, Steve, by way of short introduction, you can click through my profile and see some of their past appearances on my podcast. But Steve Zalewski is a friend to the cybersecurity community, a multi-time CISO and former CISO of Levi's. In the last episode, he shared his favorite model or the favorite version of Levi's he likes to wear. What are those called, Steve?
505s.
505s, yeah. So he's definitely ingrained, has an interesting story to tell there, and we're going to jump into that. Steve has a podcast. He's an advisor. He's been a good friend and a mentor advisor to me. So that's Steve Zalewski. And Mark Settle is a 7-time CIO. So we have this interesting interplay between CIO and CISO. You're going to hear from both perspectives. Mark is an author, multiple books. We'll be talking about one of them today called Truth from the Trenches. Mark is an investor, an advisor, a former CIO, Okta, and numerous other organizations, or should I say, Dr. Mark Settle. I learned that recently, Mark, that you're a PhD in what, geological studies?
That's correct.
That's very interesting. I wonder about the correlations there between the layers of sediment or whatever. What was your thesis in?
It was on volcanic eruptions.
I'm sure there's some parallels here of volcanic eruptions and strategic finance.
Another whole podcast, Steve. I think we're not going to be able to cover all that ground today.
Well, so be it. And so I'm going to jump right into these questions. Starting off with Mark. I want to, from your experience as a CIO, what are you hearing, seeing, and reflecting on from your time talking with CFOs and boards? What are they really looking for from CISOs when it comes to budget clarity and discipline?
So just as a point of reference, several positions that I held, the security group actually reported into me. So I was the functioning CISO. We didn't have two separate C-level executives for IT and security. So I've been in the position of making those arguments for funding. I think what both your CEO/CFO and the board are looking for is for you to educate them about how they should be thinking about the risks, the cybersecurity risks that your business, your company, in your industry, in your geography, with your customer base, what you're facing. Some orientation or grounding in what other companies with some of those same characteristics are doing. They don't have to be direct competitors. And then the way you look at it in terms of risk management. So where have you placed your bets? Like you have some kind of a portfolio of risks, and you've assembled a combination of tools and staff to do the best job that you can. And this is going to sound a little bit kind of scheming, so to speak, but you kind of want to involve them in that thought process. And so you want to kind of lay out this thesis that here's the risks that I see, here's where we've placed our bets, and I see this thing changing from the last budget cycle. So there's some new things that I'm worried about, and that's where I would be looking for additional staff or additional tools. Now, some people quite smartly will go out and involve some third-party consultants to help in that education process, so that it's not just Mark Settle saying I have a complete understanding of the risk matrix that we're confronted with here, but that there are other people that have maybe a broader understanding of those things that can kind of help as well. So those are the kind of conversations. I think there's a huge educational component, and if you're lucky enough where you're briefing the board on a regular basis, maybe a quarterly basis or semi-annual basis, you really want to get into the education component before you show up, hat in hand, asking for the money part of it. You really want to exploit those opportunities.
I apologize. I think my internet cut out there, but I got the tail end of that. And I think, we're staying on track here. So shifting gears, I think I like the education component. I don't, maybe I don't want to speculate, but, shifting from, quarterly seems about right to me, especially with managing risk. If there's toying around with the idea of, checking in on a every 6 months or longer basis, things can get kind of crazy because you've mentioned before, Mark, that at the end of the day, it's hard to measure ROI and you're still just measuring risk. But with that being said, Steve, I think one of the things that really sticks in my mind that's almost unforgettable. It is unforgettable, right? I'll take to my grave that, Steve Zalewski, your advice about cybersecurity is that at the end of the day, you're just trying to help sell more jeans. So help us unpack that for a moment. Like, explain, what do you mean? What does that look like in practice for those who aren't in the jean selling business? What does it mean to them? And why is this mindset essential?
So the way I would characterize this is that cybersecurity used to be in a position where everybody knew it was important, and therefore there was an obligation to do something about it. and the CISOs and the industry got away for a long time with us simply saying fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And as a result of that, you need to give me more money because you don't want to take the risk of bad things happening. But the reality over time is that the business is simply saying, you can't sell me on continuously investing in a problem that has no end. Because what happens then is I keep giving you money, but I'm expecting some form of metrics of proof of effectiveness at stopping the attack, because that is in essence what we committed to. But we haven't been very successful at that. So that now means, as Mark talked about, the executive teams and the business is now looking at security as a cost of doing business. Okay. It is simply something I have to do, but I have to manage it now to be reasonable. And the CISO doesn't seem to be able to give me a way of characterizing what's good enough. So now I'm going to do it myself. Okay. And I've gotten pretty good at ransomware, and I've talked to my peers, and we've all been paying ransomware, and we're all starting to dial back on the value of cybersecurity because it's not fear, uncertainty, and doubt anymore. It's a cost of doing business, and we can hide in the herd by demonstrating we have a practice, but nobody's actually able to evaluate what is the poverty line, cybersecurity poverty line, that if I dip below, right, all of a sudden my peers are better or I'm taking unacceptable risk. It just doesn't exist. Okay. So when I talk about selling more jeans, then I say, so you as a CISO now have lost the ability to try to teach Mark and the executive team about cybersecurity. Those days are gone. Now what you have to do is you have to demonstrate you understand business impact analysis, and you can read the quarterly income and loss statement, and you understand where the revenue is coming in and where cybersecurity has an impact on the business, not that it's just a cost center for the business. Okay.
I like that. So if we step back just a little bit and we look at these two perspectives around, education, awareness, and budget setting for financial discipline, and also, going beyond cost avoidance and breach avoidance to, actually, transitioning from like a fixed, protect mindset to trust. You're building trust infrastructure for the business so that you can, help customers feel more comfortable buying jeans over the internet, entering in their credit card, instead of making them go into a store, which they might not even live near one. There's a difference. And then, so those are some guardrails. I wonder, Mark and Steve, as we kind of wrap up this, context here, and before moving on, Mark, you were the CIO of all companies, Okta. That's of all the companies, that's probably a really cool one, because you get the advantage of having some really cool tech to lay down guardrails. So how do you see the balance between, did you not have to educate the board quite as much because they were already aware, and you could write whatever checks that you wanted? Or how did you balance this between protection, financial discipline, and also aligning for growth?
So in some ways, that's an unfair comparison to the situation you face in a large enterprise. And what I mean by that is we were growing so rapidly at the time, that I think if somebody had come in and said, well, let's double our spending on security, we wouldn't have had the staff, or, we were just trying to keep up with the growth of the company at the time. I think it's a little bit different than being a Fortune 500 company. Headcount changes, but I mean, it's a much bigger empire to say grace over. So I wouldn't take my Okta experience kind of at face value in terms of education. The other kind of angle on education, everybody should be aware that deals with a board. Many of the people on the board belong to multiple boards. So they're also getting education from all the other board meetings that they go to. And if they have, the living bejesus scared out of them by the Colgate Palmolive board that they attended 6 weeks ago, and they're going to show up and they're going to say, wait a minute, that the lady that's running security over there, she is completely freaked out about all these large language models that are being used by the staff to generate reports and exposing IP and, whatever. So if you don't kind of lead that discussion, you will be victimized by that question. So I think that's from the board education point of view, you got to put yourself in the situation that they sit. And the other thing that, in my personal experience, I always would do is, people would come to the board meetings having just read the popular press, and if there had been any highly publicized breach that had occurred, almost like the first question would always be, could this happen to us? Like, if you see what happened to these folks, it could be in a completely different company, completely different size, completely different industry, but they all come into that board meeting and they want to know, like, convince me that couldn't happen here. Or, these days I think it's like, convince me that we have got a structure in place that can, try to deal with this kind of a problem, that we're taking steps to deal with this kind of problem. So I don't know if I answered your question directly.
You did. Yeah. I love that angle and the cross-pollination of ideas. And Steve, before moving on, is there anything you would add to that, or, about the guardrails?
Yeah. So what Mark talked about is the board's coming in and saying the age-old question, are we safe and are we secure?
Right.
Because what the board is doing is either transferring the risk or avoiding the risk, business risk, because that's their obligation. It's not to accept the risk. They want to make sure that there is a reasonable proof that the risk has been discussed and that there's something in place to defend themselves. So again, at a brutal truth level, they're asking those questions not in your best interest, but in theirs. So as a CISO, you have this really interesting dynamic, because now the bad guys are attacking me. So I got a big bullseye on my chest. And my executives are asking me almost impossible questions to accept risk. They're trying to pin it on me. So I got a bullseye on my back. So part of this financial visibility and transparency is appreciating that that's the game. So how do I, as a CISO, now transfer as much risk back to them as I can? Because they're only giving me limited budget, and the businesses are only playing to a certain degree. And so I have to stop thinking that I have the obligation and the ability to manage all the risk and play the game back and pick out the parts of the risk that I think are most important and why, and transfer the rest back to the business.
I love that. And I think you might have noticed, and, for those who were registered for this session, saw that I wrote about managing cybersecurity. Strategic finance and cybersecurity is the key to having winning the game of cybersecurity leadership. And because right now, with that bullseye on your back and without looking at this strategically, you're in an unwinnable game. I write a little bit about that through the lens of game theory. And, so and then Steve, we also talked about the comorbid, factors in cybersecurity leadership that are undermining CISOs today that have to be looked at, right? Because the ground is moving from underneath them, and if you can study that and understand it, and take a more forward-looking or strategic, or in this case, financial approach, you increase your odds of survival. And we're going to touch upon that survival, Steve. I know you have some really cool thoughts about that. But Mark, shifting gears, the book that you wrote, which we discussed in our previous conversation on the strategy layer, you open it in chapter 1 with a conversation about finance, and almost apologetically, because why preference a book about IT leadership with such a quote unquote boring topic. But you outline from the time that the book was written, it was a fairly straightforward and common practice of having budget allocation around run, grow, and transform. So I wonder, given the timeline and the context, how Run, Grow, Transform helps to think strategically about, budget allocation, especially maybe towards the transform side, and helping cybersecurity leaders align to um, cybersecurity as an asset, or driving ROI and growth, versus just being a cost center. And then, how does this help CISOs show initiatives as strategic options and trade-offs that the board can own?
So, the word transform may have less applicability in this context to this kind of a budgeting conversation. But for sure, what's happening this year, how far did we get into this conversation without saying the term AI? But I think, that's whatever, like the new threat, call transform like the new threat, or like, this, whatever the seismic event is that's happened, suddenly 1 out of 3 companies our size has made a malware payment, and like 1 out of 10 of those has had to publicly disclose, whatever. That's kind of where the new frontier is, that you're going to have to, argue for the funds or technical capability that you need to confront the quote unquote new threat, or the expanded threat surface, or the new set of risks. But I just kind of want to take 1 half step back and talk a little bit about credibility with regard to the conversation with the CFO. And I think one of the problems that IT people have, and they share this problem with their CISO counterparts, is it always comes across to the CFO that you're always asking for more. Like, I gave you money last year, you bought all these new toys, you also wanted like X more people, and I gave you the money for X more people. Here we go again. Like, now you're back at me. You're talking a little bit different game, but the bottom line's the same. Like, you always want more. And I think the extent to which you can convince your executive colleagues that you are really managing those resources effectively. And what I mean by that is that, if you're buying new tools, are you shutting some down? Are you, reaching out and doing some competitive benchmarking about what you're paying for different tools, or even your own benchmarking, your own internal operational capability? You're taking a pretty hard look at your staff and saying, we got some people here that have been here a long time, but they just don't have the skills that we're going to need for the future. So we're going to have to, do some strategic reskilling in the group, and that's going to involve, some layoffs. I need to go find some money to start making space, because that's the brutal truth of the matter. I've got people here that just we're not going to get there at the end of the day. So, I think all those conversations at the one end, on the Run side, you've got to talk about how you are really managing security or IT like it was your own personal business, like almost like zero-based budgeting the whole organization in every cycle. Because if you don't do it, they're going to ask you to do it or tell you to go do it anyway. And then on the other side, take a look on the transform side. What's the new world that we're trying to address in this year's budget cycle?
That's really insightful. And Steve, I want to, as we were preparing through this, you had a very thoughtful counter framework, maybe more of a one set for the risk environment that we're in today. So, looking at, going from transforming to surviving, which is certainly the case for a lot of CISOs with shrinking budgets and significant increasing external risk. How do you see CISOs linking these investments and trade-offs to hopefully increasing customer trust, brand value, and et cetera, so that the business case sticks?
Yeah. And so when we were talking about this, folks, this is the way I looked at it: is Run, Grow, Transform that Mark talked about, I think, is the path forward. Because transform is, where do we need to be from a business to sell more jeans? We've got to embrace that as a CIO. And then we translate that into plan, build, run, which is how IT then takes those plans, figures out the costs and the timelines to be able to execute that, which makes perfect sense. But from a CISO's perspective, when I look at transform, what I'm realizing is I've got to go into planning to be able to figure out what risks can I address on that transformation? What are the most appropriate given the revenue? But then I have to go into react. I have to react because the bad guys don't necessarily give me the time to be able to just execute my plan. I have a defensive perimeter that's under attack. I have to react to that. And then I have to react because the transform by the business is their promise to what they want to do. But how often does that promise actually hold? They change their minds, they move in directions. And so therefore I go from plan, react to survive. And so I have to then survive those things into my next year, given the fact that I had to make some static planning around budgets and expectations for what I can do. And then I have to react to what's outside of my ability to control. And that's where now when I say transform is so interesting, because transform for the business also means a transform for the CISO and his defensive perimeter and what he can invest in. That then has to constantly every quarter be reevaluated based on what the bad guys are doing and what the business is actually executing, not what they committed to execute. And I say, so now you take those three phrases and you put them together and you get a better appreciation for how I'm trying to always look at where the business is selling more genes. But from a cybersecurity perspective, I have to demonstrate what the bad guys are doing to the industry, what the bad guys are doing to us, and how the business is playing against what they plan to do, and then be able to react to that to continue to survive. So I'm almost like a trauma surgeon in a MASH unit, where once I get my training, I then have to take all comers and do the best I can.
I love it. And I want to break down the mechanics here. I think we could go talk all day about the defensive posture, but with the theme being that strategic finance is cybersecurity leadership, breaking down the mechanics of, how can cybersecurity leaders look at how they manage the, like expense classification or shared services or CapEx versus OpEx. I was just looking at Tony Scott's post this morning on LinkedIn about organizations that are trying to roll their own data centers, again, going from like cloud and then back to rolling their own data centers, and just you can't compete with the economies of scale that cloud service providers have. So that's an interesting exercise in economics. But what are the actual mechanics, Mark? And this is going to be for you to start off. That CISOs in cyber, I say CISOs, but like you, Mark, I mean, CIOs also manage cybersecurity at times. So what are these tricks and tools and mechanics that these leaders need to master to become more credible with finance leaders?
I think you'd find in most large companies, well, maybe not the Fortune 50 or 100, but as you pointed out, Steve, most people have moved to using cloud-based services, SaaS tools, and so and even maybe some cloud platforms to host your own systems, et cetera. So your expense budget's going to be probably where you spend most of your budget, most of your money. And, there's a continual tug of war, whether you're on the IT side or the security side, between your labor expenses, and your vendor expenses. And so, I think you really need to apply some of the same analysis to your labor expenses. What job should we try to do internally? What job or activities or requirements can be satisfied maybe better by an external vendor that has a broader range of technical skills or whatever? And how do we benchmark our labor costs versus other organizations? And the same thing on the vendor side. One thing, because I've worked on the vendor side at both BMC and Okta, I think all too often both security and IT leaders, they need to look at their own organization through the lens of where the vendor marketplace is moving. So, if CrowdStrike is building a platform by amalgamating a bunch of products together through acquisition or organic development, then why am I sitting out here on an island with 5 best-of-breed products that I'm only using half of their capabilities, where, I might have more bargaining leverage with CrowdStrike to go in and, try to buy the same kind of capabilities from them. And then we talked about AI before, like how are my vendors reacting to AI? And should I get seduced away by some other kind of best of breed product that seems really cool? Or should I start to experiment with some of the capabilities that my existing vendors are pushing in my direction? The vendors will tell you as much about, especially in this, the early stage startup community, where the whole field is moving, as well as some kind of a third party consulting analysis, coming in. Again, I go, and I also would go back to, as much external benchmarking as you can do. I think that raises credibility, and getting a third party in, which boards like to do, to kind of do a hygiene check on how you compare to what they're seeing, elsewhere in the industry. And again, quite frankly, for the audience here, that's a good COIA exercise too, because if something goes wrong, you can say, well, we were all misled, third party came in and took a look at what we were doing, and they gave us a pretty clean bill of health, or, they told us to go they told us to do 10 things. We could only afford the top 3. So we did the top 3 that they said, but, I think, Steve, as you had mentioned before, have we taken can we convince ourselves, not ourselves, can we make the case that we took prudent steps based on our knowledge to protect ourselves to the best of our ability? That's kind of all you can do at the end of the day. And I think at this stage of our, if we were still in operating seats, we're smart enough not to stand up and say anymore, well, I'm guaranteeing you that we'll never get. And frankly, I think boards have gotten sophisticated enough. If you got up and said that, they'd say, we got to get another guy. He's deluding himself, like he's walking around. We got the wrong guy on this job.
Steve, the build versus buy versus maybe acquire is an interesting conversation, and kind of piggybacking on what Mark said, like in your experience, what moves the conversation beyond risk into business impact?
Yeah. And it's something that Mark talked about. We gotta dive into constraints. Okay. As an engineer, right? I have requirements, I have assumptions, and I have constraints that I have to consider. And many times the CISO doesn't think of it as an engineering problem. They think of it as wants and needs. Okay. So they tell you what they want. And then the board says, I can't do that. So then they start whining about, well, I need it. You didn't give it to me. Okay. I want to take a step back now and talk about our friend, the CFO and the CPA and OpEx and CapEx. Okay. And I saw this at PG&E and I saw it at Levi's. Many companies live on a CapEx model. When you make an investment, it has to be capitalized over 3 to 7 years, depending.
Yeah.
Okay. And what Mark was talking about was when I buy cloud services, that is not something I build. That is not a physical warehouse. It's not a physical power station. It's not a physical building. Okay. It's not transformers that I can amortize. It's an OpEx service. But if finance says for $1 that I'm giving you, 80% is CapEx and 20% is OpEx, okay? And my requirements to be able to be in the cloud is I need 50% OpEx and 50% CapEx. That's a constraint, okay? And the CEO can't do anything about that because the CFO said that's how we've agreed to the rules. And that's what I mean about, so now for Mark and I'm like, well, wait a minute. If out of that dollar, only 20% can be OpEx and 80% has to be CapEx, but I need 50-50, okay? That gets back to take a step back then. And where can I negotiate to use those CapEx dollars in an OpEx way, not by explaining to the finance people why they're wrong, but by saying, well, if I do a 3-year deal with a vendor for OpEx materials, will that make it CapEx then because it's a 3-year deal? How can we negotiate for me to leverage that dollars? And if I have to spend it if I have to make a 3-year deal, well, I only want 2, but it's the only way I can get those dollars, then you go to the board and you say, here's my strategy, here's the constraints that I'm living under, and this is the best that I can do. So what you've done is you've shared the responsibility of the decision because the CEO knows he had a role in the constraint that you have. The CFO has a role, so they can't blame you because you've identified the constraints and demonstrated how you've done the best you can do.
Now this is getting interesting, and I think for maybe young, I've never been a CISO. I'm very clear about disclaiming this whenever I speak or whenever I write, but I'm an advisor to CIOs and CISOs, and I've spent a lot of time studying this challenge, kind of like Jenga. But I think this is a really interesting problem, and I wonder if we sit with this for a minute, Mark, what you would add to this dilemma that Steve created of 80-20 versus 50-50. Like, is the negotiation between the CFO and the CISO, or between the CISO and the vendor, or a combination? And in this negotiation, what are the pitfalls? Where do CISOs and cybersecurity leaders make mistakes that put them in a defensive posture versus more proactive and partnering with the CISO versus butting heads and being at odds with the CFO? Does that make sense as a question, Mark?
Kind of. To Steve Z's point, yeah, if there are some ironclad kind of financial constraints, like this is the way we run the company, and I've been in those kind of companies. You can't fight those kinds of things. Now, I guess on the good news side, if you will, if you signal to a vendor that you want to buy their product, they will bend over backwards and find almost any pricing mechanism, model, magic, that's required to take your money. So, we shouldn't characterize this as an insurmountable constraint, number one. No, I don't have a whole lot to add beyond my prior remark of it. It always comes across as more. I'd say another good thing to do with CFOs is to try to paint more of a multi-year budget picture for them. It's almost like a placeholder for 2027, okay? Like, hey, this AI thing is out of control. I've got some existing vendors that are already pushing some AI products. My gut tells me this isn't going to be good enough. Or in our specialized industry, we have so much intellectual property. We're a pharmaceutical company, but that whole technology area of AI governance is moving so fast. I don't want to place a bet now. So I'm going to experiment with like 2 or 3 things, spend a little more money, but I want to take a flyer on 2027. Once I figure that marketplace out, I'm going to be back here because I'm not feeling good about 2026. This is a Band-Aid effort. I'm not trying to sit here selling you that we've got that whole waterfront covered. So I belabored that just to say that CFOs do a lot better when they have some like early warning signals of what's coming downstream. And again, if you can go back and say, and you know what, this is the year I'm finally going to cut the cord. I'm going to turn off 3 of these tools because in our current risk posture or whatever, they're really not worth it on a zero-based, budgeting effort or mentality. They're just not providing, the protection that we need. And I'm just going to parrot something Steve Z said before. The whole problem with cybersecurity is there are really no concrete efficacy measures. So we keep talking about reducing risk. And what boards would love to hear, for $2 million more, I can take risk down from right now, I'm 95% sure that we're not going to get hit. And if you let me spend $10 million, I'll get us to 98%. And there's a formula, I just see the math. Look at how I did this.
Well, with AI, I think that the next step would be, would you like 99% risk reduction for $5 million more?
Well, I'm back to my prior comment. If you try to sell that, you won't be in that position for too much longer. And to a certain extent, a third of CISOs have either been fired or laid off or quit in the last 4 years. And I would say, again, brutal truth, some of what you're bringing to the attention is we are culling out of the herd those that think that security is important for security's sake. Okay. And so therefore they are, to a certain extent, establishing the fact that they are not the ones to take the company forward, and the board is getting smarter. I have an anecdotal story which the audience may enjoy. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference, and the CISO from Bank of America was there, and I learned. So he reports directly to the board, or that position reports directly to the board, not through anybody else. He works for the board. So he presents his budget. He told us, we couldn't believe this. I think the whole audience had a heart attack. He said, well, every year after I make the budget presentation, the board says, well, if we gave you more money, what would you do with it?
Like, what, like, we don't want you to feel constrained, but you're trying to fit you into a spending envelope. And so he'd have to reassure them, oh no, I think I have plenty of money at this level. Like, I think this is exactly this is good enough. If you gave me more money, I wouldn't know what to do with it. And I don't think there are many CISOs or CIOs who have ever had that luxury before.
Well, for $3 million more, I can give you 99.98% risk reduction.
The way he characterized it was a gut check. They asked him, like, how does your gut feel? Do you feeling pretty good about like $400 million? So do we need to go up to like 450? Would that be better? Anyway.
So I'll share, since we're at that stage, let me share a story too, like Mark, okay, around this, which is CISOs for the most part, and here's what you keep us saying. We come in, and to a certain extent, we're selling risk reduction against a vulnerability that people can intellectually appreciate, but there's no efficacy metrics to be able to demonstrate that we're doing something, because it's like trying to find the mosquito in the room, okay? Which is, you may get one, but did you get them all? You don't know, but we highlight the fact that we found one, therefore there must be others. And that is not carrying weight anymore. That's all I'll share with me, which was, we used to try to sell cybersecurity risk, detect, prevent, respond, recover, as a way of demonstrating value with our audit committee, and they struggled. And then one time I came in the 5 minutes that you get, and I said, I'm going to recharacterize the ownership of cybersecurity, or what cybersecurity does. I said, cybersecurity does three things for this company. It protects the brand, it protects our workers against social engineering attacks, and it protects our supply chain to make sure that jeans are always in stores so that we know we're in business. And I said, those are the three things that cybersecurity has a material impact on, that every one of you now realizes if the consumer data is compromised, we lost our brand, and brand damage is clear. Okay, you all are getting all the social engineering attacks, hacking all the time, and it's killing us, because here's the statistics. So I got to continue to up the game. And if we don't have jeans in store, the supply chain, and that means our cloud supply chain and our physical, we're out of business no matter how good everything is. And I said, so what I just told you was, these are the three things that are important to me. Everything else is off the plate. And this is why, and now let me show you where your dollars are going to protect this against what the threats are that are hitting us. That was an aha moment for everybody in that room to suddenly realize, now we see a value proposition very clearly. And what cybersecurity is doing against something that we as the business and the audit committee can absolutely internalize. And that was my aha, kind of not funny story, but and then all of a sudden there's this pause in the room, and the whole demeanor changed, and then questions started to come out, right? And all of a sudden, the respect in the room was, okay, finally, you've committed a story to us that we understand. And it's exactly what Mark said. They're like, Steve, we now understand that we have a fiduciary responsibility in a way we never understood before with cybersecurity. And now we got some questions to ask ourselves.
Yep.
That's a great skill, Steve. I talk a lot about this transition from cybersecurity leader as a risk manager to a transformation or strategic multiplier. And I think looking at this, through the financial lens, you bring this vocabulary that's shared or common among the C-suite and the board, versus just coming and asking for more money. So as we shift here and towards the last 10, 12 minutes or so, I'd invite anyone watching, feel free to submit any questions in the chat. Steve, if Mr. Zalewski, Mr. Settle, I'll relay these questions. We'll put them on the screen and we'll tackle them live. This session is for you. We want to make sure your questions are answered, or if you have any smart comments. Thanks, Barbara, for chiming in. I want to just kind of, I know there's a, we laugh and we have fun, and we talked about using some colorful language in the prep here about just how difficult this world is that CISOs are living in. And Mark and Steve, you mentioned neither of you are sitting in the role right now, which is, but you've been in it many times. And I want to just kind of take this to a more specific and apply apply these concepts into 2026. As you know, if you're in the role, or you probably do advise CISOs, what is the single biggest change that cybersecurity leaders need to make in how they approach budgeting and finance now, starting in September 16th, heading into 2026? Steve Zalewski, starting with you.
Okay. So I'm going to use AI again and budgeting, which was, as a CISO, AI has been weaponized for offense incredibly well over the last 36 months, especially with Gen AI and agentic workflows. Okay. Incredibly well. To a certain extent, I have to weaponize AI for defense because humans cannot react fast enough in many cases to the capabilities of the AI agents weaponized for offense. So therefore, how do I have to embrace AI in my security organization? So things like an AI SOC, things like AI for pen testing, things like AI for GRC, that I'm never going to get enough humans to do it to be able to counteract the weaponization. Therefore, I must adopt. And how does that look to be on the forefront now of adopting security tools that are AI based to be able to weaponize for defense? That's one. And then the other one for me is looking at how AI is being embedded into the business processes of your company and teasing that apart to understand where AI truly has a business impact, that I have to put some protection life insurance policies around those lines of business. Whereas for the rest, I can just put some guardrails that says, hey, if you're going to use the technology, please be careful, okay, about how you use it. And here's good practices, but I am not going to prevent you from playing in traffic. And so again, what it is appreciating for how I have to adopt AI from my security organization that is pushing the envelope of what I potentially want to do because I don't want to give up people, but I can't delay because the bad guys are way ahead of me. And then for the business, same thing. I have to figure out which ones really are going to go into production and let the rest of them just play. So I got to make some really hard decisions. That goes into 2026 budgeting that I would suggest for those listening to apply that from a CISO's perspective to be able to characterize the two ways that you have to stretch your dollars.
I think the only thing I'd add to that to kind of amplify what Steve just said. If you have a pitch, you're getting ready for the board, or even if it's still the internal pitch with your own executive leadership team about what you want to do for the budget next year. I mean, Steve, you've hit this pretty hard. It's a business conversation. I mean, if you go in there and try to have a technical conversation with them, it's really a waste of everybody's time, and it will be ultimately counterproductive. You know, you kind of sound like a scientist who's conducting an experiment using your company as a lab bench, and like, you know, I'm going to take these following steps, et cetera. So just as Steve pointed out earlier with his comments about the customer base at Levi's and the supply chain, et cetera, you know, really try to, we said this, understand and characterize the risks from the unique perspective of your company, its maturity, its geography, its products, its customers, its partner relationships, et cetera. And then the second thing that I always counsel people learn facts, but they remember stories. If you pepper that pitch with 2 or 3 stories, they don't even have to be from your own company. You know, go to Cardinal Health. They got a big supply chain. Guess what? And it's not like you have to go out and spend all your time networking with your peers at other companies. Listen, the vendors know all the stories. The vendors know all the dirty linen stories. You don't have to cite, you know, the source of the story by company name or individual person. But, you know, here's a company that operates like us. They got these suppliers. Guess what? One day, one person got into social media and used the same password credentials that they use for their Salesforce access. And before you knew it, like the whole, you know, the thing out of the barn. The horse is out of the barn. So that's the other bit of advice, is just be very careful that you have a nicely arranged PhD analysis of, like, plan, grow, run, and I'm slotting these investments into these categories, and I'm doing 2% more this year and 5% less over here, and whatever. Your recommendation may be based on that kind of analysis, but nobody wants to be led through the nose through that conversation.
Or in Steve's words, plan, react, survive. We're in survival mode. I love the conversation. We have two questions here, and one of them right along the lines, Mark, of what you were talking about. I like the pattern recognition and the storytelling. So we have Collins from Collins Debaki. Thanks for the question. And I think you can see it on the screen, Steve and Mark. Asks about the importance of storytelling, and is there any space in the boardroom for technical discussions? Good question. Steve, Mark, one of you want to take this, or both of you?
Go ahead, Mark.
No, you go first.
All right. Storytelling is incredibly important, but the story cannot be about fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It has to be a story that reflects the business processes or the knowledge of your organization, that you really understand what the business does to be able to reflect that back. An example, okay, if I have a cyber attack, okay, and it takes out my supply chain, the story I had is we actually did this as a desktop exercise with the executives. We had a circumstance where our distribution centers were impacted with ransomware and our OT had to go down. So the question I asked to the team as the CISO for business impact analysis is, I said, how much inventory on average do we have in our stores by which I must reestablish the distribution center to get new stock to the stores? Okay, ask that simple question. And the answer was between 45 and 90 days, which shocked so many people. But then when you understand why, it made sense. And I said, so I don't have to put you in a circumstance of hurry up, make a decision right now, because we got to get it going. We can afford to take 3 to 5 days and think it through. That's an example of a story that you're telling for everybody in that board, to not try to train them about security, but to understand the impact of how security has a substantial existential threat in certain cases, but how to be able to recover. That's my example, to be able to do something like that, to make that clear. And then with regards to technical, you got to know your company. And here's why. If your company is highly technical, it's a SaaS company, then the CEO and the founders are highly technical. They will not accept your word for anything. They want to be able to understand the technology briefly to make it a white box, to then make it a black box. So to that degree, yes, but if you're not in those environments, you're going to bore them with technology. They're trusting you, which is why they're paying you the big bucks, to just be able to show them the solution, and you worry about the technology. Mark?
One suggestion I would add with the board: don't ever be afraid of a divide and conquer strategy. So if you have 1 or 2 people on the board who are much more technically astute and inclined and interested, give them their own private briefing on the way you're looking at the AI problem, et cetera. The other board people know that, Steve Z is the smartest guy in the room when it comes to AI or IT or technical or CISO stuff. So they're always going to defer to that individual to start with, or that 1 or 2 individuals. And if those people say, I spent like a half a day with Mark, and I get it. Like, I see what he's talking about, and I think, it makes sense what he's recommending, et cetera. And it's the best of all possible worlds, because if you don't do that, then you get there and you're not technical enough for those 2 people. So they talk about you behind your back after you leave the room, and you're too technical for the other 8 people on the board who could care less about RAG and, reinforcement learning, So anyway, just divide and conquer is a very effective way to address some of the issues you're going to have trying to bring a board along technically. And again, at the risk of repeating myself, just don't forget they go to other board meetings, and so people may have scared them with some terminology or whatever, that you've got to to help translate into your business. We keep talking about the translation step. So this is all.
I love these. There will be notes. Anyone listening, you can reach out to me. I'll send you the executive summary and the key takeaways as a document from this session. Just connect with me, send me a message. I'll send them out to you. So you don't have to take notes, or if you take notes and you want my version, I'll send them to you. So one last question. This comes from Richard. Hello, Richard. And let's see here. He talks about where do concepts like risk capacity, risk appetite, and tolerance play a role? I think we've already touched a little bit about this, but maybe if we kind of want to wrap up around, risk. Mark, I know in your analysis that, at the end of the day, right, it's really hard to generate a credible ROI. You're managing risk. And I understand that. I just commented on a post this morning that from my perspective, I just want to encourage cybersecurity leaders to not buy into the risk quantification as a true religion, to have a more balanced view with context of the environment, of the company, et cetera. But as closing thoughts, Steve, Mark, do you want to kind of wrap up on this topic of risk capacity, risk appetite, and tolerance heading into 2026?
Well, I deferred to Steve the first time, so I'm going to take the floor on this one. And in the interest of sort of like getting real, let's say you bring in that third party to look at what you're spending money on. And you talk to them when they come in. You let them go. Then you sit down with the CFO and say, you know what, if we have a major breach, the board's going to call Mandy in here, and they are going to do a proctology exam on our security spending like you cannot believe. And they're going to say, the top 3 things these guys should have done are these 3 things. And I'm only asking for 1 out of the 3 things that Mandy will come in and say were absolutely essential. Now, I'm going to lose my job, okay? Like I already know that's going to happen. I'm trying to save you from losing your job. So if you can't go find me the $1.5 million that I need to plug this number 1 priority that Mandy's talking about, that's the real risk we're both accepting at the end of the day. We've talked about risk in a very ephemeral way, but I'm talking about job security risk, which any C-level executive can relate to.
The risk of ignoring. I like to put it in that ROI, right? Return on investment, risk of ignoring.
Steve?
So here's where I say the banking industry has done us no favors. And here's why. Risk registers came from the banking industry because the banking industry is all about risk.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's it.
Yep.
And they have very complex risk registers based on hundreds of years of empirical data. The CISOs want to play that game. The CISOs have what, 10 years, 15 years of empirical data for us to even have a risk conversation? So we've created the illusion of complexity in those risk registers that all other CISOs, for the other 85%, are trying to do the same thing because it's been told that that's the way to do it. And it's an impossible task right now. So I go, so if you want to play the risk register game, be careful, because it's a house of cards, because it's not defendable. But some say you have to do it. And what I would say is, if that's the case, then don't just go through the exercise. Think it through like Mark said, and make it relevant to what you know you can do to stay alive another day and not create a risk register that's pretty but is undefensible.
There's your motto for CISOs: live to fight another day. I like that.
I love that. This conversation has yielded some very interesting insights, Steve. I think you never fail to deliver on new. I don't know where you it's like you have an infinite wellspring of insight to share, and we're, as a community, indebted to you for your time and grateful for you to share these so generously. And Mark, you as well. I love reading your posts, and you're staying up to date and investing and guiding companies in AI and exploring productivity in the workplace. And I thank you for sharing your wisdom with us all. If you're watching, I encourage you all to connect and follow with Steve Zalewski and Mark Settle online and me too as well, if you're not already following. And if you have any questions or want the key takeaways from this session, feel free to reach out. But with that, I think we're 2 minutes past. Thanks everybody for joining. Have a great rest of your afternoon, evening, wherever you may be, and a great week. Steve Zalewski, Mark Settle, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you,
Signing off.
Mark. It was a pleasure.